Hello and greetings. I'm Renee Cummings, and it's really wonderful to join you. And I trust you've had an amazing day given the exciting agenda of this summit. So, I'm a criminologist, I'm an AI ethicist, and a data activist. And I'm going to have a conversation with you about AI, how it's advancing, and where we are. So, there's so much happening in AI at such speed and at such scale. And I'm really excited to be part of this industry and this movement. I'm very passionate about AI and its extraordinary potential and possibilities as it continues to transform our world. My work examines the relationship between AI and society and the long term socio technical impacts of AI on our socioeconomic, sociocultural, and sociopolitical systems. AI is also the most dramatic game changer of our age, disrupting just about every aspect of our lives, every industry, every methodology, every thought, upsetting the balance of power and creating a power structure of its own, backed by an arsenal of AI tools and techniques. So, AI is a superpower and it is super powerful. But if left unchecked, this superpower has the potential of becoming very deadly and very destructive. And that's what we don't want. And that's why, as an AI criminologist, an AI ethicist, and a data activist, I'm so committed to ensuring AI gets it right, AI does no harm, and that diversity and inclusion and equity are critical components to build equitable and inclusive technology, and to ensure that diverse voices, our voices, are amplified and that all groups are represented. So, from healthcare to AI being able to detect breast cancer before the human eye, to drones and autonomous weapons and autonomous vehicles, so deep fakes and different disinformation campaigns, and even foul speaking chatbots, to augmented reality and virtual reality, and the ability of AI to digitize and analyze massive amounts of data and reconstruct history, reconstruct wars, reconstruct old trade routes and triumphs and defeats. AI has created a common language and a common culture powered by machine learning and deep learning, and with code, a language of its own, recoding our world in real time. So that's absolutely amazing and so imaginative. But there's also something about AI that we need to discuss that's not so amazing and not so imaginative. And every day I confront some of the most unimaginative and disturbing and deeply rooted reductionist thinking and gauche attitudes in AI, such as bias and discrimination and systemic racism that continue to be normalized and legitimized in algorithms, and that continue to deliver devastating, if not deadly outcomes to Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other marginalized and vulnerable groups. So it is critical that we expose the hidden effects of algorithms, racial, economic, educational, health, justice disparities, algorithms that marginalize, algorithms that continue to victimize, what we call poly-victimization of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other underrepresented and unrepresented groups. So to ensure we erect those robust and dynamic and rigorous ethical guardrails. Um, some of the work that I do looks at AI governance, good AI governance, and how do we protect privacy and respect data rights and respect data sovereignty, ethical guardrails that are dynamic and vibrant, that outline AI risks and take a risk based as well as a rights based approach to AI, ethical guardrails that audit AI systems and interrogate algorithms. So, as an AI criminologist, I examine algorithmic decision making systems in the criminal justice system, AI decisions in policing and sentencing and corrections. And the news isn't very good because in policing, my work explores the real time risks of algorithms, policing, and how intrusive mass surveillance technologies have found their ways into the ways in which we police. And we've got to look at bringing an ethical approach. And that's what I do, attempt to bring an ethical approach to the application of algorithms in policing and creating that requisite pushback against the unlawful and legislated use of algorithms and its destructive potential because something that we're not thinking about and something that I have to think about daily is how destructive algorithms are for underserved high needs communities, black and brown communities in particular in the US and other marginalized and vulnerable groups. So what we're now witnessing in law enforcement would be that without reasonable suspicion and without a warrant, think about that, law enforcement is using algorithms, predictive analytics tools, to delve deep into our lives and to easily, with one click, with one scroll, with a tag, make us a person of interest to the police without us ever knowing until, unfortunately, we are arrested. And that's what we call a digital arrest. And it's something you've got to pay attention to. But most of us aren't paying attention to the deployment of algorithms in the criminal justice system and how our cell phones and social media platforms can be surveilled or are presently being surveilled. So, from arrests and wrongful arrests by algorithms to arraignment by algorithms in the courts, the outsourcing of criminal justice decision making systems to opaque algorithms and risk scores that frustrate due process and systemically overestimate the risks of Black and Brown defendants in sentencing. We're seeing that algorithms have been disproportionately unfair and racially biased, again, codifying unconscious bias and systemic racism in the administration of justice, in corrections. We have seen an algorithm that says you are a risk to public safety, although you have completed a 15-year sentence of good behavior, exemplary academic achievement, and outstanding personal development while being incarcerated. Yet, an algorithmic decision making system or an algorithmic risk assessment tool continues to deny you parole because proxies for race, such as data points, like family instability, socioeconomic risk factors that correlate with structural poverty and unemployment and financial history and educational history and your address. These proxies for race have become data points and become part of the data that built the model to assess criminal risk. So these are things that are happening, and in the blink of an eye, an algorithm can make a false prediction in the criminal justice system and change the trajectory of your life and create a history of intergenerational trauma, denying liberty and often denying life. So, in criminal justice, in public benefits, in healthcare, in finance, education, hiring, advertising, politics. I mean, this list isn't even exclusive. We have seen the dangerous possibilities of AI that lack a framework of ethics, that lack a framework of accountability and transparency and explainability, auditability, understandability. These are critical to AI and to designing algorithms and deploying algorithms into the public domain. So, this is why it's so critical for each of us, no matter where we stand, to take a leadership role in ensuring that an ethical approach to the design, development, and deployment of AI is critical. We've got to do that. And we've got to do that by embracing things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and fostering an inclusive and equitable AI ecosystem. Because AI is widening the digital divide, and we need to use AI to close the digital divide and bring more equity to technology. So, what I'm challenging you to do is to own your own data, own your own AI legacy. Create your own data narratives. Don't fall asleep on AI. Stay woke on AI. So I challenge you in the work that you do, if you are working in a digital space, take nothing for granted. Confront the data and confront that painful past of colonization and enslavement and imperialism and Eurocentrism encoded in the data. Think about those punitive data narratives that have historically punished marginalized groups, and think about those adverse data experiences of vulnerable communities and the misleading data narratives encoded in algorithms and the default discrimination in the data. Challenge the data power structure. Think about the quality, the classification, the annotation, the interpretation of data. Who's doing it? Who's not doing it? Who's included? Who's excluded? Who's getting to write those data narratives? So deconstruct the data, look at those data disparities and inequities, the social structure of data collection, the power and the privilege inherent in the data collection process, the political underpinnings of data. These are all critical to the work that I do as a data activist. I challenge you again, decode the data. Look at the historic, systemic, and institutional discrimination that's baked into the data that we use. Look at those widespread biases that persist in society and how prevalent they are in the data structure. Look at those pre existing patterns of exclusion and inequality, also a part of the data structure. And look at the impact, the desperate impact of data on marginalized communities. So it's up to you. You have an opportunity, if you work in the digital space, to disrupt the data. You've got to do that. Disband this idea that science is neutral, or the fallacy of raw data. No data is raw. Promote the amplification and the visibility and representation of all voices in the data power structure. So dismantle the data, dismantle the design, the definitions, the designations, and the distinctions that we attach to data. Dissect the data power structure and the system that rules the data. Look at the sociological, the political, the economic, and cultural impact of data. So, in algorithms, it is obvious, and we are seeing more and more research, that algorithms inherit prejudices. And those prejudices deny historically disadvantaged and vulnerable groups representation, visibility, full participation, and equal access to resources. So AI presents new challenges, but are we using new technology to create old thinking? So we've got to look at the new risks that AI creates, such as we are further disenfranchising individuals digitally, digital marginalization, digital profiling. We've got to think about those things and how they impact Black and Brown people of color, underrepresented, unrepresented, marginalized, vulnerable groups. We've got to pay attention to that because we have witnessed how systemic racism and bias and discrimination live in algorithms and continue to live and get new life in these algorithms, and how algorithms impact the communities that are most marginalized politically, economically, and socially, high needs, underserved communities that need the greatest support from AI, and how the wealth gap continues to be widened through things like digital profiling or digital redlining. So there is much to be gained from the application of AI, and I feel confident that AI is going to do the right thing in real time. But there must always be that concern, that due diligence, that vigilance that requires a different kind of consciousness when it comes to understanding data and when it comes to understanding how algorithms are designed and developed and deployed. So we've got to think about that, and we have really got to pay attention to that. So there is much to be gained from the application of AI to just about everything we do. And in my own work, I'm looking at ways in which we can apply AI to rehabilitation and reducing recidivism and building the reentry process for returning citizens. So making that transition from incarceration back to society a seamless and an easy and a supportive one. I'm also looking at ways in which we could use AI in policing to treat with police violence and reduce police violence and bring more accountability and more transparency. So in one space, I work in a startup state of mind in another space, I work in an ethical state of mind because I believe that ethics does not stifle innovation. And if we bring an ethical approach to innovation, embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion, then we are creating a technology that is more inclusive, more equitable, and more dynamic. So we must create in everything we do when it comes to technology, new and emerging technologies, an environment of careful ethical stewardship and of those rigorous and robust ethical guardrails that are required to ensure that AI does no harm and to ensure that political motives and proprietary rights and profit do not take priority over human rights and civil rights, data rights, our rights. So AI can improve lives, it could enhance lives, it can change lives, and it can save lives. But AI can also destroy lives. So the decision is ours only if we are part of the decision making process. So I challenge you to become a part of the AI power structure. I challenge you to ensure that we use this technology to include all histories in the legacy of AI. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Renee. That was
Sure.
just, I don't even have any words. I'm left speechless. And all the comments in the stage seem to echo my feelings as well. So we've had a few questions come in.
Sure.
I'll read them out to you now. So firstly, how can law enforcement engage with a more fair and equal AI?
Just repeat the question. Is it how could law enforcement engage?
Yes, how can law enforcement engage with a more fair and equal AI?
So at the minute, what we're seeing is the fact that technology always outpaces the law. That's just how it's been. So what we are seeing in particular in technology, and when it is applied to the law enforcement space, is that law enforcement is playing around with technology. But you can't play around with technology because you're playing around with people's lives. So you would find in the US, there has been a movement to ensure that public oversight of technology is critical. The other way is training. Law enforcement has not really been trained on this technology because it's still very new. It's still in the experimental stage. So everyone is experimenting, everyone is playing. So what is required is that consciousness and to understand that this technology could have a deadly impact on the communities that you serve. And it could re victimize and further marginalize communities that are in need of resources. The other way, other than law enforcement being trained and law enforcement embracing an ethical approach to it, and the law ensuring that the law enforcement approach using technology is regulated, we've got to educate our communities. We've got to educate the public. The public has got to know what is its rights when it comes to the deployment of this technology. And that's why the pushback is so critical at this stage, because so many things that are being deployed, from facial recognition to algorithms that read your license plates, and the police are using these things without a warrant because they don't need a warrant. They don't need a warrant to go on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and scrape all the information they need. If you're protesting in a march on your college campus, or in a union activity with your job, or on the streets as a part of a racial or social justice movement, it doesn't mean that the police have access to use a photograph that's taken on their body camera and then go and search you out in social media and then try to weave together a case without any reasonable suspicion, because what you were doing was part of your constitutional rights. So it's about public awareness, it's about public education, it's about creating the requisite regulation, and it's about us being eternally vigilant and understanding data is very powerful. It could be monetized and you're not profiting from it, as we're seeing with our data that's being used by big tech, and it could also be weaponized against you. And you've got to be careful about that.
Amazing, thank you. We've got another question that's come in. So it's, isn't AI subject to the command of the senior administrator or CEO of the company that owns the AI, such as Robocop or Terminator?
You've got to repeat the question. If it's
Isn't AI subject to the command of the senior administrator or CEO of the company that owns AI?
Well, definitely the command structure of the organization is putting the money behind the technology that's being built. That's why it's critical for us to ensure that organizations embrace an ethical organizational culture and to ensure in the design space of these organizations that we have diversity at the table. Now, diversity in itself does not ensure that there's going to be diversity in technology, but it does ensure that the requisite checks and balances are in place. It also ensures that there's intellectual confrontation in that space. So, and the space is open to people really discussing the long-term impacts of the technology. I always say that AI is a legacy technology, and we've got to be certain that we are sure that the things that we're doing with this technology are going to serve us in the long term. So this is why, as an AI ethicist and a data activist, much of my work is bringing not only risk-based sort of perspective and understanding to the design, development, and deployment of the technology, but really bringing a rights base. So letting these companies know that people have rights. And then when you think about a robot, you've got to think about if the robot does something illegal, who's to blame? The designer, the one who deployed it, the one who's using it in the company, or because we just can't take a robot to court, right? We're not there yet, but we've got to think about so many things. This is why it's so important to have these conversations.
Absolutely. So we've got another question that's come in. As an inclusion advocate, what's your advice on how to get involved with tech ethics?
So what you can do is, of course, you've got to ensure that you're on top of the knowledge. So it's critical for you to have that broad base. So you've got to do some reading and ensure that you start to engage in your social media platforms with individuals who are in the field. The other thing that you want to do in your company is ask a question. Reach out to HR. Ask them. Of course, you're not doing this to to risk your job, but I'm hoping that the company has an open environment where you could have this kind of discussion. If you're at a university, you can do it there, or just ensuring that the conversation begins is so important, because in so many spaces we're not having this conversation, and AI is just developing with leaps and bounds, and leaving so many of us behind.
And then I think this is our last question to come in, which I think is a great one, and hopefully can leave some excitement rather than fear in the audience. So, do you think it's too late to change the algorithms?
Oh, well, no, it's data that we're working with. And although we understand that some data sets are going to be baked with when it comes to bias and discrimination and systemic racism. And let me apologize for the surround noise. I live in New York City, in the heart of Manhattan, so it is always very noisy. And today is extremely warm, so everyone's outside in the city. So that's the music coming from the cars. So what we've really got to do. I just want to say this, because before we end, which is, I don't want anyone to leave with a feeling of fear. AI is very exciting. This is the industry of the moment. I am in the industry working as an entrepreneur, working in the startup space. But I also have a residency at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia, and I have a scholarship at Columbia University, because I believe in innovation. But I believe in ethical innovation, because so much of my work in the realm of justice looks at exclusion, and for too long people are being excluded. So what I want to do is create space at the table, or build my own table and build my own chairs, and seat people there to do the kind of work that we do. So it really is about engaging that perspective, creating space for other people, and really understand that as powerful as this technology is, it is as powerfully destructive. So it's about public education and public awareness. It's about, when you design with a kind of consciousness. When you design with vigilance. When you design with an understanding of the history of data, the history of exclusion, the history of discrimination, the history of misrepresentation and underrepresentation. So these are the things that you need to build the kind of consciousness. So what I want this to do is to inspire you to change the legacy of the technology, to change the data that's going to be used to build the algorithms. And if you're using the data that's out there as the algorithms are being built, be that person in the group to say, wait a minute, wait a minute, we've got to pay attention to this data because the outcome may not be the outcome that we want. Be that voice of advocacy, of change.
I every time you speak, Renee, you just leave me speechless. And I think with your answers as well, more and more questions are coming in. So we've got two more questions
Sure.
that would be great to take. So firstly is, what's your take on the future of work around the factor of ethical thinking in regards to automation in artificial intelligence?
So I think there's been a lot of fear generated around that, and we've heard how many thousand jobs are going to be lost by this year and that year. But I think what we can do, we can start to upskill. And once we start to upskill, we could ensure that not only do we keep our jobs, but we get jobs to match our new skills. So again, too much fear around it. Yes, some jobs are going to be lost, but with all technology, right? When the steam engine came into beer and we started to use the railroads, people weren't riding horses again. So I guess the people who were grooming the horses and fixing, doing all the different things, the silversmiths, the who were doing all the different things with horses, right? They lost their jobs, and maybe they were employed on the railroad. So what I'm saying to you is, don't be fearful. Be prepared. Upskill in real time. Think of ways. I had to do it. I had to do it. When I looked at where criminology was going, I couldn't just think about, criminology pre-tech or pre-digital or pre the application of AI to the criminal justice space. So I had to pivot. I had to reimagine. I had to reinvent. It's about being relevant. And that's what you want to do. Don't fear automation. Focus on being relevant. Be prepared for it.
Absolutely. So we've got a question from Marika at what point should organizations in the startup process be collating and or thinking about capturing the data sets as an asset?
So your voice keeps dipping. So
Oh,
I'm not hearing the questions fully. Could you just repeat?
yes, absolutely. At what point should organizations in the startup process be collating or thinking about the capturing of data sets as an asset?
Well, from the beginning. I mean, the minute you come up with an idea when it comes to using new and emerging technologies such as AI, you've got to think about the data. Where am I getting the data? How am I storing the data? How is this data going to be shared? How are we going to analyze? These are questions that you're thinking about. So that process begins at the same time that you have an idea to start up. The other thing is that most times we acquire data sets, we buy data sets, and this is why we need to be vigilant, and this is why we need that consciousness to ensure that when we get the data that we have, if we're data scientists, if we're developers, if we just have a love for data and want to play around with it because we think we can do something different with it, we need that knowledge to understand the history of the data, to understand what's trapped in that data. And sometimes when we look at data, we've seen, and even in my work, I look at the transmission of intergenerational trauma through data, particularly when it comes to the industry of finance and real estate, and the fact that many families don't have access to wealth, not because they didn't have the potential or they didn't have the aptitude or because they didn't have the opportunity, because the data was working against them, because the bank looked at a particular history and said, this isn't a person that we can lend money to because, they live in a particular community that's a particular financial risk, or they've not had the kind of education, or they don't have the income earning opportunity. So we've got to think about all of it's just a lot to think about. And I think, this is a great time to do it because we're creating a legacy, and we want to be included in that legacy.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So that is the end of all the questions. So I guess, Renee, if there are any last minute remarks or any last words that you would love to share with our audience, that would be appreciated.
Well, I mean, I wish I could have seen your audience, but I can't. But I'll say this, I feel the energy, and I will say to you, get involved. If you're already involved, you know what you got to do because I think I've outlined that. If you want to get involved, you can get involved right now. I am not a data scientist, although I have a working knowledge of data science. But I think what I bring is a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary perspective, and that is what AI needs more of, those dynamic, multidisciplinary collaborations, collective intelligence. So if you are working in any field that may not be data science, you can still get involved in AI. We need you. You've got to, because if we're going to use this technology to really build a better world. And we need all of us in the space doing the work, because we have all got to be represented. So enter the space and do some good work. And I know in time I'm going to see you somewhere along that AI life cycle and be very proud of the work that you're doing. So thank you for inviting me, and congratulations on a fantastic summit.
Thank you so much, Renee.
Sure.
You've shared just such unmatched knowledge, and it's such valuable advice for